Now we're using this V-Ray dome light, well really it's just a V-Ray light set to dome with an HDRI in it to do the basic lighting of our scene. So all you do to create this is to go to Light, V-Ray, V-Ray light, put a random light out here, and then set it to dome. And it does that. And it doesn't really matter where you've placed it or anything like that because it's a dome that will encompass your scene. Once you have your dome created, you can modify it to be what you want. And the essential part is this texture here, which you just put a V-Ray HDRI texture, and I'll have a look at that in a second. Multiplier is set to 1. Let's look at some of the other options here just to see what they are. Spherical, full dome, that's great. That means it has a ground and a sky. Effect alpha can be turned on and off so that when you render, it will either show as an alpha so you can replace the background, or it will not, depending on how you have that set. And you'll want it to, and then it has the settings of a basic light. So you can turn on invisible. If you wanted the light to emit light for your scene but not be shown as your background, you would make it invisible. Okay, but we want it basically just default, and all we need to do is replace this texture here so that it's actually using an image to emit light. And if you don't know what an HDRI light is, well, a dome light is just a light that encompasses your scene, but when it really starts to work is not as a solid color, but as a high definition range image, which has enough depth in it that it can actually provide light information for your scene. And I'll show you what that means. The way you would set this up is by, well, let me show you here. If we drag this over here and hit and make it an instance, we'll then have control of this map over here. If this wasn't here, then we could click on it and say, go to V-Ray and say V-Ray HDRI, and then you'd select an HDRI for there, and then you just drag it an instant like I just did. So this actually wants to be instance here, so we need to make sure that this and this are linked, and now we can edit it here and it will have an effect on our light. So let's look at what I have there. I have this basic HDRI. So HDRIs, you can search for them on the internet, you can purchase them. This is a purchased one, so I can't provide it for you. It does not belong to me. You can search for HDRIs and pop them in here, and you can see that that is just a 360-degree panoramic image. But if you look at it in Photoshop or in other photo editing software, you'll see that it has so much depth. Like this spot is very, very bright. It's not just white, it's white times 4 or something like that. And the dark areas are very, very dark. So it has that whole range in there, and 3ds Max is able to take that range and say, oh, this is extremely bright, it's white times 4, so that's like emitting a certain amount of light, and this is really dark, so it's not emitting any light. So it actually is just using this image to actually light your scene, to physically light your scene. So the way they create those is with multiple different exposures on the same picture, and then they combine them together, offering that huge amount of range, and that range is enough to actually provide light information to your scene. Most of you are probably familiar with HDRIs and how they work. I'll provide some links of where to find some good free HDRIs for your scene. So amazingly, that image applied to that V-Ray dome light is all we need to light our scene the way we saw in our rendering. Another interesting thing to consider is that we put a middle gray on everything as our material override, but actually in this scene it's going to be kind of overwhelmed with white surfaces. If these panels remain white like this, then our scene is going to be a lot more towards white than it is towards middle gray. So if we change this to be closer to white, like here, then we'll get a more accurate representation of what our rendering will be when we have all our real materials on here. So this is something to consider when you're doing an override rendering. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, by turning up the brightness of the material, the override material, we're now getting a more accurate representation, something that's closer to what our final materials will actually look like. So that actually brightens up the room quite a bit. Now, if we wanted to darken up the room, if we wanted to do one of those dark panels with just highlights around where the table is, we could do that too. And again, we would just do it with override material to give us an overall much darker scene. So if you wanted to go with a theme of darker materials, then you could change your override to something that's much darker, and that will give you a good idea of your lighting there. So let's do that with a dark gray, and maybe I have these lights here for the candles. And we'll get into what those are and how they're created, but for now I'm just going to turn them on so we can see what it looks like with very dark textures and just candlelight lighting the table. See what that looks like. Okay, interesting. This looks dramatically different, right? But keep in mind we're not changing the exposure of our camera at all. It looks like nighttime over here, but it's not. We just put a darker material overall on our scene. So this gives you kind of a preview of different kind of effects you could get depending on what kind of materials you use. So if I use like a black wood floor and dark gray panels, then my lighting overall would look kind of like this. If I use the white materials that I have in here currently, it will look more like the final rendering I've showed you before. So that's something to keep in mind depending on what color scheme and material scheme you want to go with. That will adjust, that will change your lighting quite a bit. So I know that this is going to be a light room, so I went with a light override material, and that gave me a more accurate representation. But amazingly, you can see that with just the simple light coming in from outside, and in this case, these little candle lights, how much changes you can make and how much lighting can go on, how much reality you can create with just some very simple lighting techniques. One thing I should mention as well before I go with the HDRI is some of the settings inside of the actual Vray HDRI map. Okay, so the light, the default light, or the dome light, we basically left at default settings, but in here is where you can make additional adjustments. So that image, the main things that you adjust in here are the overall multiplier, or at least the way I do it, and then the horizontal rotation. So when you're looking at this, consider that 0.0 right there. Okay, now when you're looking at the top of your scene, and your light is here, that line going out, that's going to be 0.0. So the middle of your image is going to be right out here. So a lot of HDRIs are set up so the sun is right in the center, right here. And that will be right here at this line. Consider that 0. So if you do 290 rotation, it goes 90, 180, 270, 290. Okay, well, 290, right about here. So the middle of my image is up here. That's how it's being emitted. That's how it's emitting light. In this one, I think the sun is off to the side a little bit, and so, or maybe it's because my image is rotated. Yeah, so it's actually coming, the middle part of the sky is coming at the same angle as this sun right there. So that's kind of perfect. You need to make sure you're on mapping type spherical. For almost all HDRIs I've seen, that's the mapping type that you want. And sometimes HDRIs come with their own instructions, but most people, when they construct them to be used with a spherical mapping type, which is great. It's like taking a spherical image on your phone, same thing, except with multiple exposures. Okay, so the horizontal rotation I showed you, the overall multiplier you just mess with. If it's at 1, it's like that. I put it at 10 because think about when you're inside and then looking outside into a bright afternoon. What happens? Your eyes, you start squinting because it's so much brighter outside than it is inside. So what you are doing is exaggerating the brightness of outside as compared to inside to make it really, really bright. And so you saw in the final image that the light coming from outside is kind of blowing out in that window bench area. And that's how it should be. If you look at interior photography again, you'll notice that the outside is almost always, unless it's very overcast or unless they do camera tricks, is going to be much more exposed than inside. So that's why that's turned up to 10 to be very bright, and that's why you get that sharp, direct light coming in through the window. Let's move on to some of the creation of some of these other lights and start adding them in so that they add to this light and start creating the overall effect that we're looking for.